Hello, my friends. It's Pastor Siri, and as promised, today we're going to be rethinking heaven, hell, and the devil. Take a listen. First, I want to begin by saying the reason I'm doing this is because, yes, I said that we should be able to examine all of the thoughts we have that we have been brought up spiritually and religiously. They should all be able to hold up under scrutiny. And one of the reasons I bring this up is because for many people who've come from a faith background, a Christian background, the teachings of heaven, hell, and the devil have been so black and white and so strong that they're really hard for us to loosen the grips of them. And the reason I say loosen the grips of them is because a lot of those teachings have often done a lot of damage. And we often think, well, they're biblical, right? They're Christian, right? They're part and parcel with the Bible and Christianity. But that's not true. So much of what most Christians think we're supposed to believe about heaven, hell, and the devil is not actually biblical. Beyond that, they were inventions of a very specific strand of Christianity. But there have always been Christians who have had different beliefs. And that's something I want to share with you in general, that there is no one particular Christian way to view anything. There's always been a plurality of beliefs. But let's jump in. Now, these are huge topics. Books have been written about all of these. So what I'm offering is a very, very slim overview. And if you have questions or you want to get deeper, let me know and I can go deeper. But first, let's start with the general concept of the afterlife. So in the entire Hebrew scriptures, there's very little mention of the afterlife, and there is zero, yes, I said it, zero mention of the devil in the Hebrew scriptures. According to the people who were writing and reciting and reading the Hebrew scriptures, they had not grown into and developed any sense of the devil. And life on this plane was what mattered. People believed that when you died, you went to Sheol, to a place of sleeping, and that maybe there would be some last final day when all the dead would rise and some new reign would begin with God. But they didn't really spend a lot of time thinking about that. You don't have a lot of information on that in the Old Testament, and that's not a big focus. So people did believe that what happened in this life was going to have consequences in this life. And that is a whole nother topic we're going to get into about suffering. So it isn't really until we get into the New Testament that we start to have newly developed ideas of words we call heaven and hell and the concept of the devil. But again, I will say, if you collected all of the verses in the New Testament that mention heaven, hell, and the devil, it's a lot smaller than you think. It's really not as much as what we've made it out to be. As I mentioned in the last video, Jesus actually doesn't spend a lot of time telling us how to get to heaven and how to avoid hell. He's teaching us how to align ourselves with God now and heal ourselves now. So there are mentions of what we consider heaven, hell, and the devil, and let's start with heaven. First of all, in the Aramaic, which is the language that Jesus would have spoken, their perspective of the world was completely different from a modern American perspective and very different from a Greek perspective. Our scripture has been filtered through at least Aramaic to Greek to Latin to German, to English, or so on and so forth. All of that filtering of words means that you have to make choices in how you interpret a word. And choices are never going to be unbiased. They're always going to come from your perspective, from your time period, and your understanding. So we've done a lot of reading back into the Bible with our own interpretations and over time. But in Jesus' time, the concept of heaven was not some place you went to after you died. It was the Shemaya, the vibration of God that penetrates all things in this entire world. God's Shemaya is absolutely everywhere, and it is a place of healing and a place of love and gratitude and joy. And this is everywhere. And so when Jesus is talking about the kingdom of heaven has come near, or the kingdom of God has come near, the Malkuta, the energy, the reign, the activity of God, the Malkuta de Boshmaya, what Jesus is talking about is that creative, energetic vibration that is all around us, is around us, and it's near us, and it's in us, and it can even move through us. And that is like our birthright. We have been separated from that, not because we're bad, horrible human beings, but because we got sucked into the story of the world. Our consciousness got dragged down into this other place. And that is not a good place for us to be. God doesn't want us to stay there. And so one of the things Jesus felt very strongly was his mission was he was going to show us how to break out of that stuckness by connecting with the Shemaya of God. And that creative, vibrating energy changes us, opens us up from the inside out, and ravels out into the world, making this world slowly more and more of a place where heaven is thicker and thicker and thicker. Okay, hell. First of all, one of the words that is often used for the concept of hell, because hell was not a word that was ever used, but Jesus would use the word Gehenna, which was the burning garbage pile outside of Jerusalem, a very scary, creepy place. And there are people who lived there. And so it was clearly a visual that Jesus was using to try to give people a visceral feeling of what happens and what it feels like to be completely out of sync with God. If you think once again of God as a vibration, and when we're in harmony with God, when we're sort of synced up with God in our own human way, it feels good. We are our full selves. We're losing our fears and our traumas, and we are slowly becoming more and more of who we were meant to be. And it feels good. Life isn't perfect, but man, when we have those moments, it's great. And to be more and more disconnected, to be more and more turned in on ourselves, and to be like where you're defensive and offensive and like, get away from me. Why are you talking to me about that way? Like, look at that face. That's what happens to us when we get really turned in on ourselves and we get sucked into this really awful story of who we are and who other people are. And Jesus is saying to keep going on that path, to believe those stories, and to keep behaving towards other people in this way, and to keep behaving towards yourself in that way, to believe those stories and let them impact your acting. It's like living in a garbage pile that's burning. It's hellish. And it isn't a place you go to when you die. It's a place you're creating now. It's an energy field you're getting sucked into and you're sucking other people into, and it's gaining energy, and that's just going to keep going. It keeps spinning out, even past your death. Heaven and hell are vibrations we're a part of here on earth that we connect to or disconnect from, that carry on later unless there's an interception, unless we are redirected in the right path. So Jesus was never threatening hell on anyone. He was simply warning that if you were stuck in a sucky story of suffering and pain and abuse and all of that, you didn't have to stay there. It was not good for you to stay there. It was not good for anyone to stay there. Okay, finally, the devil. I did say that there was no devil in the Hebrew scriptures, and you might have been like, wait a minute, what about the book of Job? And again, we can go deeper into the book of Job, but the beginning of the book of Job is first of all, it's a parable. It's a parable. And the beginning of the book of Job, the Satana figure, the advocate figure, was part of the heavenly court. This was not the devil that was coming from some hellish realm. This was part of the heavenly court, and this is a story that was meant to put up a very strange situation to teach us as readers something about God's mercy and the way things work or don't work. So the Satana simply comes up as somebody who questions and says, you know, if you're just nice to everybody who loves you, then how do you know if they actually love you and they're not just doing it to get good grades? And God's like, okay, well, let's allow for bad things to happen to this person, but I'm telling you, they're still going to love me because we have a close relationship. That was not, no one was in a recorder in heaven recording this conversation happening going, God, that's kind of a bad move on your part. Like, why would, no, because that's a premise. It's just a premise. It wasn't until in between the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament that the Jewish people began to formulate the concept of a devil, of some sort of entity that was way beyond anything that they'd ever considered before. And yet, in the very few times we have mention of demons or demonic activity, mostly in the book of Mark, and of Jesus going to the desert to be tempted by the Satana, as I mentioned, you can see these as literal entities. I'm not telling you what to think. I'm just offering another perspective. As I mentioned in a previous video, the Satana in Aramaic is that which we will not look at, that which can drive us off course. So yeah, that could be an external entity that is trying to get at you, that's trying to hurt you, that's trying to make you a victim of its work. But it can also be something that comes from within. Not that we're bad, not that we're awful, it's just part of the human condition. Part of our not knowing what the heck is going on is that we create these shadows and parts within ourselves that are immature, that are destructive, self-destructive, and they can be very powerful. You know, there's addiction, there's all sorts of things that sometimes feel like they're coming from the outside, and sometimes they feel like they're coming from the inside out. It can be both. It doesn't have to be one or the other. And Jesus faces this within himself. He faces this possibility that he could be pulled off course in his work. He faces that part of himself. And when Jesus is going into villages and places, he sees people who have fallen to prey to some of that really dark energy. Again, external, internal, or some combination of both. There are oppressive powers and energies in the world. You can walk into a room and feel the residual energy of deep pain, abuse, and violence. That is why in almost every culture in the world, they will do ceremonies to clear out bad energy and evil spirits, things that are attracted to the darkness. We don't have to be afraid of them, and it's not the main goal of a Christian to deal with spiritual warfare or to worry about the devil. I don't see that as being a huge bonus. Jesus is saying, do not be afraid to look at the darkness inside yourself and around you, because God's love and God's healing and wholeness is more powerful than any of that every day of the week, always. So Jesus comes rather into the darkest places, into people who are experiencing some really rough stuff, with the ability to, if they're open to being healed, he will offer a healing and bring them out of that stuck, small, dark place and into that open alignment again, back into vibration, into the Shemaya of God. That's it. So, like I said, this is a very brief overview. We could pull up Bible verses like crazy. There are beautiful parables that Jesus talks about in Matthew that we could go into great detail. But again, Jesus was using striking imagery to grab people's attention, which is a very Aramaic thing to do. We don't appreciate that so much, especially we take things so seriously. We hardly ever read humor in the Bible, and we often take things extremely literally and seriously. So when Jesus says, if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off, we're like, holy cow, Jesus, that's intense. 2,000 years ago in an Aramaic setting, everyone would have been like, okay, he's just trying to he's just trying to underline and emphasize what he's saying. We get it. No big deal. So Jesus uses these parables and he uses this imagery because he is concerned about people in general and certain power structures that are not embodying the energy, the healing energy of God, the Shemaiah of God. Instead, we have a tendency to create and amplify hellish vibrations, hellish types of things, both within and that manifests out. And Jesus is trying to nip it in the bud, get us to see what's up, and extricate ourselves from that suffering. When we are freed from that suffering, that ripples out. Every person who's freed and rises up into vibration with God is another person who's a beautiful channel for the activity of God in this world, which we need so much today. So focus, if you will, it's your invitation. Focus on that every day, which makes you feel like this. Yes. Focus on that every day. Focus on syncing up with God who wraps you in love and wraps you in mercy, compassion, and grace. And then see what happens. So that's all for today. I really hope this has been helpful. My desire always is to say that which is going to be freeing and healing for you. And we will see you next time. Bye-bye.